Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to focus on a lot of different issues. In just a few minutes, we'll talk about the Iran deal that is dead, but that has also led to a back-and-forth battle between Israel and Iranian targets in Syria, so we'll talk about that. 3 Americans held by North Korea have come home, and Vice President Mike Pence had some things to say about that this morning. Of course, last night, President Donald Trump met them at Andrews Air Force Base, and so we'll get into that, as well as some questions that people have now that indeed there is a move forward to construct more of the wall, or to fix at least some of the wall between the United States and Mexico. How effective is that? And, of course, there's been some ongoing testimony about the issue of immigration, and so I want to get into those topics as well. So lots to cover this hour. In the next hour, we're going to be talking with Dr. Scott Lively, individual that has been a pastor, worked very much with what oftentimes is called Massachusetts resistance, and really wanting to stand up for Christian values in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now is actually a candidate for the governor's office because of campaign that took place there, and so we'll get a chance to talk to him about the value of still remaining with a Christian set of principles in the Republican Party. And then the third hour, which, of course, if you would like to listen online, you can do so. And we have in studio with us Dr. Darrell Bock, and we'll be talking about Israel coming up to the 70th anniversary of the nation of Israel, so certainly a lot to cover there as well. But since this is a Dallas broadcast, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about a Dallas story. And if you've read the Dallas Morning News, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, if you watched Channel 8 News last night, Channel 11 News, those are just a few places where this has shown up. I suspect it was also on Channel 4 and 5 as well. It tells a story of a Cedar Hill High School student who was captured on video shoving his teacher and cursing at him because the student's phone was taken away. Now, there have been all sorts of people that have come forward and lauded the professor, or in this case, the teacher, I guess you could say, since they're not necessarily called professors there in high school, for showing a level of restraint that, candidly, I'm not sure I would have been able to do so. The issue was it's a physics class, so it's not exactly a place where people shove each other. It's not a place where you go up and challenge the professor, the teacher. I just can't even imagine how this happened. But again, if you've seen the video, you know what I'm talking about. The student is seen knocking papers off the teacher's desk, then demanding the phone be returned, cursing at the teacher, and then putting his hands on his neck and kind of pushing him, then walking away, grabbing the phone. Okay, first of all, let's give high marks to a physics teacher who, after being shoved, after having his desk completely rearranged by a student, after having a student curse at him, did not escalate the situation. High marks for him, and everybody's been talking about that. Can we talk about the other part of that? I hope so, and I'd love to get your comments about this as well. If you've seen the video or you've read the article that was today in the Dallas Morning News, there was an article in the Dallas Morning News, there's one in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, there are all sorts of other stories about this. Again, at Cedar Hill High School, student that challenged this professor. And again, an individual that, oh, by the way, I might just mention, after the student challenged the teacher, He stormed out of the classroom, later returned and did apologize, and the mother also sent an email apologizing. Okay, so far so good. But what you have right now is the school district saying, well, they're going to take disciplinary action. I think they owe it to the American people, or at least the listeners and viewers in Dallas, to explain what that is. Because if the disciplinary action is that he maybe gets a study hall or something like that, or maybe has to stay after school for a few minutes, I don't think that's an appropriate punishment. Just again, those of you that are a little bit older, think if you had done something like that with one of your teachers. This is in a physics class, so it's probably even less appropriate than something that might have happened, say, in a gym class where people are kind of pushing and shoving sometimes, or playing games and that kind of stuff. And again, I can think of my coaches, if nothing else. I'll just use my basketball coaches for example, because both my basketball coaches taught history. One was a history teacher for world history. Another one was an American history teacher. I can't even imagine anybody in the class doing that, but I can't imagine the reaction right afterwards. I can imagine either one of my coaches, who would be a teacher in the history class, grabbing that student and putting that student in a headlock and marching that student down to the principal's office and making sure that he is expelled. I don't necessarily say that's what the physics teacher should have done. He did not want to escalate the situation. But nevertheless, you've got to ask yourself a very fundamental question. Has this young boy, in other occasions, done this to other individuals? I mean, it does take a bit of bravado, maybe a fair amount of stupidity, to come up and want to choke a teacher who is still in a position of authority. Has he done that to his mother, who issued an apology? Has he done that to a girlfriend? And this, I think, is one of the issues that I think we sometimes need to come back to and talk about the fact that when an individual actually crosses that line, it, I think, becomes a whole lot easier to cross that line once again. For young ladies listening right now, or wives listening right now, or sometimes even husbands or boys listening right now, if somebody's put their hands on you, don't think that after they apologize, they will never do that again. The reality is they probably will. And if nothing else, I think this is a good example of a visual image of something that if you've gone out on YouTube at all, you've seen time and time again. There has been some YouTube videos I've seen where teachers have been assaulted by students, thrown to the ground, punched, kicked. There are surveys, and we talked about this recently when we had Lance Izumi on the program, of some of the issues of physical abuse that the teachers are facing right now. Sexual innuendos, physical abuse, intimidation, all sorts of actions. And so, if nothing else, I do hope that Cedar Hill High School spends some time not just talking about how they appreciate that this physics teacher showed some restraint. High marks to him. Nothing that I'm complaining about in terms of what he might have done in a situation that could have easily escalated. Although, again, he was unhappy that the video got out. Well, I don't know. Maybe this can be a lesson for the student who indeed shoved him, destroyed all the papers on his desk, walked out of the classroom, and only later returned. Again, what kind of school do we have? If I walked out of a classroom, I wouldn't not be invited back in. And if a teacher or a principal saw me in the hallway, they want to know where I am, where I'm supposed to be, and why I'm out there, and what just took place. And so I just love to get your comments. We're going to move on to some other topics. But if you've had any thoughts about this assault by the student at Cedar Hill High School, I would encourage your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, we also broadcast this not only on our Point of View website, but also on Facebook. If you'd like to leave a comment there, we'll pick up some of those comments as well. Love to get your comments. What should the school do? 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
How accurate are fact checkers? Many fact-checking sites are tied to newspapers and others are independent operations. Often they provide a valuable service. Sometimes, though, the fact checkers need to be fact-checked. Such is the case with Snopes, which is one of the best-known fact-checking sites. Snopes did an analysis of one of the criticisms of California Assembly Bill 2943, which has been making its way through the legislature. The bill would prohibit the sale and distribution of books and counseling that is aimed at helping people overcome their same-sex attraction. One member of the California Assembly wondered, if this bill were to pass, would this prohibit the sale of the Bible that teaches these things about sexual morality? Snopes rejected the statement, saying that the bill does not mention the Bible, Christianity, or religion at all, and concluded the statement was demonstrably and clearly false. Robert Gagnon, writing in The Federalist, acknowledges the bill doesn't mention the Bible, but explains that it is irrelevant. He says, sure, it is virtually impossible that California will immediately attempt to ban the sale of the Bible itself. Not even the hard left in California has that kind of chutzpah. But citations of Bible verses in the context of declaring homosexual practice and transgenderism to be morally debased could indeed get one into serious trouble with the law if it comes in the context of selling or advertising a product or service. He concludes that Snopes heavily shades the truth. He then suggests read the bill. There is no religious exemption. There is no restriction to mental health professionals. This bill in the California legislature is much worse than the fact checker would have you believe. It may not ban the Bible, but it would certainly ban all sorts of books and counseling in the name of promoting the homosexual agenda. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. A couple of the articles I've posted here have to do with the decision to actually back out of the Iran nuclear deal. And so if you'd like to read some of those, they're available on our website, pointofview.net. Of course, we go back a couple of days, and then we'll talk about where we go from here in the future. The United States, of course, through Donald Trump, decided to exit the Iranian nuclear accord, did that on Tuesday, and in some respects dismantled the most prominent foreign policy initiative of President Barack Obama. You do have to wonder sort of what ends up in the Obama presidential library, because so many of the things that were part and parcel of his administration are either gone or dismantled in one way or another, whether it's the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, whether it's the nuclear accord, which now we have withdrawn from. But nevertheless, that's something that the president did the other day in the diplomatic room of the White House. I had a number of things to say about it, that it was horrible, it was one-sided, it was disastrous, and again, kind of took apart the 2015 deal that was put together, 11-minute speech, then sat down and signed an order withdrawing the United States from that. As, again, you have the Vice President, Mike Pence, the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, and the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, in the room agreeing with that decision. Where do we go from here? Yesterday, we probably could have spent some time talking about this, but we did play a tape, so I wanted to come back and say, okay, what does the future look like? One of the articles we posted was an editorial by the Wall Street Journal, in which it said President Trump withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, rightly calling it defective at its core.
Yet he also offered Iran a chance to negotiate a better deal if it truly doesn't want a nuclear weapon. I don't think that's even a possibility, but let's at least keep the conversation going a little bit longer. Donald Trump's challenge now is to build a strategy and alliances to contain Iran until it accepts the crucial constraints that the previous president refused to impose. The Obama administration spent years negotiating a lopsided pact that actually gave Tehran $100 billion of sanctions relief and a chance to revive its nuclear weapons program after a 15-year period. But instead of cutting off all of Iran's pathways to a bomb, as the previous president was claiming, the deal just simply delayed the country's entry into the nuclear club and gave those who are running the government there in Iran, the mullahs, cash to fund their Middle Eastern adventurism, which I'll get to in just a minute because we have actual missiles being fired both from Syria and from Israel. We'll get to that in just a minute. The case that the president, Donald Trump, was making was bolstered just about a week ago, you might remember, because you had Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who revealed intelligence that showed that Iran repeatedly lied to UN weapons inspectors about past nuclear activity. And so that is certainly something that was, I think, helpful in terms of making that decision. You've had some that have come up against the president more recently, making statements that this is one where we could actually monitor those installations and determine whether or not they have actually been involved in nuclear development. But again, if you were to actually read the fine print, Iran said, yes, you can actually monitor these various sites where we have in the past produced nuclear weapons grade material, but you cannot monitor these military sites. Now think about this for just a minute. Imagine that if you're a judge or an officer of the law enforcement, and you were told that, yes, you can actually, even though you have a search warrant, search these bedrooms, but you can't search that bedroom. Where do you think the weapons, the drugs, or whatever you're looking for are going to end up in? And so the fact is that since these inspectors were not allowed to actually inspect some of the places most likely where that kind of activity was taking place, you have to either believe that these are really honest people, or just believe that this was an attempt to try to have a deal or an accord that really didn't have any real teeth in it at all. So again, President Trump the other day said any nation that helps Iran in its quest for nuclear weapons could also be strongly sanctioned by the United States. So what he has done right now is said that over the next 90 to 180 days, the United States will reimpose the highest level of economic sanctions on Iran, and these sanctions will cut off Iran from global financial systems. And, of course, this is the question that is on the table. Will Europe go along with this, or will Europe continue to have euros flowing to Iran? And the president not only had a strong message to Iran, as far as I can understand it, on Tuesday, also had a very strong message to Europe. So, again, what's next? And one of the articles I've posted here is by David French, who's been in studio with us before, in which he says that we have, again, this particular deal, which was described by the president as one of the worst, most misguided, most destructive international deals in American history. It's now dead. Good. President Obama's foreign policy legacy, based in part on the flawed notion that legitimate grievances against America were the fuel for the jihadist fire, have now been rejected. Good. The Trump administration now fully owns American foreign policy, and it's now fully responsible for dealing with Iran. And that's where he says good with a question mark, because is that really good? And what are we going to actually begin to do? Because the point is the first step is the easiest one, and that is to pull out of a nuclear accord. this is the one that's the crowd pleaser. This is the one that at least a lot of people are applauding. These are the individuals saying, hey, this was what the president-elect said he was going to do. This is what the candidate said he was going to do. He's waited more than a year to do it. And if it wasn't for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he may still be kicking the can down the road, but did not. But, okay, what is next? David French has a couple of ideas. First, and critically, America should resist any immediate urge to engage in a new round of deal-making with the jihadist regime. It's time to reset the strategic picture, he says, not to come to the table as new, better negotiators. That's the sucker's bet. The American message in the interim should be clear. Any move by Iran to ramp up its nuclear program will be seen as a threat to vital American interest and dealt with accordingly. There will be severe cost to any change in the nuclear status quo, and Iran must be aware of that fact. That's point number one. Point number two, he actually agrees with a statement by Eli Lake, who said, quote, the most urgent task now for Trump is increasing the odds of success for Iran's democracy development and movement, because, after all, Iran isn't North Korea. There does exist a domestic reform movement that has at least a chance of achieving real change. Yet, as Lake notes, Obama's Iran deal enriched the regime that Iran's Democrats are hoping to change. And as he says, there's no clear, easy path to democratic reform in Iran. And he says Eli Lake is correct that Iranians will be the authors of their own liberation. But there are still measures the administration can take, he says, from specifically targeting sanctions to support for the means and measures that allow dissidents to communicate and coordinate, to putting America's thumb on the scale for reform rather than Iran's theocratic regime. And then third, he says we must beat Iran on the battlefield, not by invading or declaring war, but instead by ensuring the endurance and ultimate victory of our allies in the proxy conflicts raging around the Middle East. We must not abandon our allies in Syria. We must not cede even an additional inch of territory in the combined Iranian, Russian, Assad forces in the country's northeast. We should provide prudent and proper aid to Israel and its efforts to weaken Iranian-backed forces in Syria and Lebanon, and we must work to curb Iranian influences in Iraq. Well, I'm going to take a break. When we come back, that, I think, helps explain why all of a sudden, as we're getting close to the 70th anniversary celebration of Israel, which we'll talk about in our third hour today, why there have been rockets fired from Syria into Israel and from Israel into Syria at Iranian forces. That is another part of this. Not only is there diplomacy, in some cases, there are proxy wars, and there's military action. So we'll talk about that as well. Put a couple of issues on the table, and if you'd like to join us with any of your comments, that number is 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to read some of the articles I'm reading from, they're available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
If you've listened for any length of time, you've probably heard about Point of View listeners who've done amazing things, started ministries, found their life's calling, impacted their city, their state, the nation. But let me be clear, you don't have to have a huge impact to be faithful. I thought about that when I read a note from Joanne in Texas. She admitted, up until recently, I've not had much of a political view, nor have I ever been so informed. But since I signed up for your email and website information, I can now get the correct information that the public is oblivious to. Joanne ended by thanking us for the Take Action section of our website, where we make it easy for you to express your views on key issues with your elected representatives. Everything we do on the air, online, through mail and email is made possible through people like you who invest in Point of View so we can invest in issues that matter. Take your place on the Truth Team. Call 1-800-347-5151 or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the other things that I thought would be appropriate to talk about in light of the Iranian deal, which is now dead and maybe renegotiated, is what that means in the Middle East. And we didn't have to wait very long to figure that out. Some 20 rockets were fired at Israeli military bases by Iranian forces from southern Syria after midnight on Thursday, sparking what now might be the largest ever direct clash between Jerusalem and Tehran, with Israeli jets targeting numerous Iranian-controlled sites across Syria. These widespread deadly raids against them were again after rocket fire towards its forces were blamed on Iran, and this incident only came shortly after sort of the rising tensions and the following of the decision by President Donald Trump to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal. Let me add to that a few other things, and that is there is also a move from the American embassy in Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. There is a picture that you can see in one of the articles we have that actually shows the mayor of Jerusalem putting up the sign that shows where the new American embassy is. And so that's another issue. And, of course, as we will talk about in the third hour today, and we'll spend more time on Monday talking about, it is the 70th anniversary of the founding of the nation of Israel in 1948. And so that's something else to begin to focus on as well. The Israeli army said that the initial missile barrage was carried out by members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Corps Quds forces. This actually appeared to be the first time that Israel attributed an attack directly to Iran, which generally operates through its proxies. There has been a proxy war taking place, especially in Syria, but in other places in the Middle East for some time with Iran. Some of the incoming missiles were intercepted by the Iron Dome defense system. If you're a new listener to Point of View, you probably don't even know what that is, but we have talked about this in the past. It is sort of a strategic defense dome, which actually is an amazing piece of technology. The example that we've used before, it's like somebody a mile and away shooting with a rifle a bullet at your face, and having you pull up a handgun and firing another bullet and hitting that first bullet in the air. That's not a bad illustration of how accurate and careful this technology is. So quite possibly some of those missiles did not actually do any harm. But again, the damage supposedly, according to the IDF, that would be the Israeli defense spokesperson, was limited. In response, of course, Israel has launched an extensive retaliatory campaign striking suspected Iranian bases throughout Syria for hours following the initial Iranian bombardment. And so we'll see how that plays out. The raids that a monitor said killed 23 fighters were one of the largest Israeli military operations in recent years and the biggest such assault on Iranian targets. The defense minister said, "We hit nearly all of the Iranian infrastructure in Syria. I hope we finished this episode and everyone understood." Of course, this is, again, one of those battles that probably will not just end as a result of the firing that took place last night of these various first rockets and then some of the military action, but we will see. And again, I think tied, if not directly, certainly indirectly to the Iranian deal, which is now dead, and also the attention of the world, which will be focused, I think, over this weekend and all the way through Monday and Tuesday, probably, in Israel because of the 70th anniversary. It will be interesting to see some of the comments, because almost every time that Israel does anything to defend itself, it is suffering from criticism from many of our so-called European allies. Just before I move on to another topic that would certainly be of interest, I think, especially to those in the state of Texas and in Dallas, let me just mention that last night this will receive some fanfare, probably not as much as it deserves, but the release of 3 Americans by North Korea and the suggestion that this might actually suggest that there is a breakthrough possibly coming from North Korea. I think anyone has to be somewhat skeptical about North Korea all of a sudden trying to cozy up with Donald Trump, maybe thinking, well, this is a new president. We can see if we can limit some of the get some concessions, limit some of the sanctions, but continue our nuclear program. We'll see. But so far, so good. And today you had some comments by the Vice President, Mike Pence, who said that watching 3 Americans who'd been freed from North Korea's labor camps arrive back in the United States was an incredibly powerful moment. And he believes that it's a direct product of diplomatic pressure on North Korea by the Trump administration. And certainly kudos go to the now incoming Secretary of State, previous CIA Director Mike Pompeo. In an interview that the Vice President did on NBC News Today show, Vice President Mike Pence credited President Donald Trump with having changed the policies of the United States from an era of strategic patience with North Korea to move towards the kind of campaign that would bring economic and diplomatic pressure to bear with reserving all other options. He also said that he is convinced that maybe we're on the edge of a huge breakthrough in relations with North Korea, and then went on to say that we do believe that the regime in North Korea has taken steps that indicate that this may be an opportunity for a breakthrough, the kind of breakthrough that's eluded the United States and the world community for more than 20 years. Went on to say a little bit later, to see these 3 Americans come off the plane, we hope is a sign that there's a real opportunity to achieve peace on the Korean Peninsula. And so, of course, not only was he part of that, but again, we might mention that the president could have simply slept in his bed, said, I'll pick up with them in the morning. There's no reason I need to go to the Andrews Air Force Base because, again, if you're not familiar with how that is done, you have to, first of all, mobilize the Secret Service to protect you, because you will go out of the White House onto the South Lawn. You will get into the helicopter, and the helicopter will fly out. So then, of course, you have individuals that have to be protecting you there. You have the air support, and then you eventually land at the joint base, Andrews, what's called Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. And then you have to sort of be protected there until these individuals land. And so the plane carrying the 3 men, all American citizens of Korean descent, touched down at 2:42 Eastern Standard Time. That, for all of us, it'd be 1 o'clock in the morning. For those of us in the Dallas area, more than 20 hours after they were handed over to U.S. officials. And, of course, there is where the president met them. And, of course, this morning you had the vice president making some statements about that. Where do we go from here? Well, again, one of the reasons why we want to not have a nuclear Iran is illustrated by the nuclear North Korea. Do we really think that North Korea would continue to exploit its individuals, or do we really think that North Korea would have any kind of presence in the world community if they did not have nuclear weapons? And, of course, the answer is pretty clear. Now, it might be difficult to cross the DMZ. We have probably more mines in the grounds there and more sensitive things that would prevent us from ever reunifying North Korea or South Korea without just a tremendous amount of work. But the possibility of a united Korean peninsula is certainly one hope. More importantly, the opportunity to have a denuclearized Korean peninsula would be something as well. And a good illustration when we look at North Korea and Iran, when the argument was that Iran, if indeed you're going to enter into this deal, you have to allow us to inspect these various areas, they would not allow us to inspect those. By contrast, there was quite a willingness on the part of Muammar Gaddafi, for example, and others that have allowed inspections so that they would not suffer the consequences of a military action against them. So we will see whether or not this is anything more than a bluff by North Korea. it is a possibility, and a lot of the things that we would never have think even possible. For example, North Korean diplomats and North Korean officials coming to South Korea to watch the Olympics. The North Korean president, Kim Jong-un, coming down to South Korea and walking with the South Korean president. I think pretty significant factors. May not necessarily be in the fall of the Berlin Wall, but certainly a significant development. We'll continue to watch it and see what that means. Speaking about walls, let's come back and talk about now the Trump administration has decided we're not going to wait any longer. We're going to build a wall in San Diego area that some people in California want, others don't. We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Brian Finnemore is described as a fundamentalist Christian. He worked for a hydroelectric company in Bangor, Maine. Everyone there knew he was a Christian, and that's where the problem seemed to begin. The talk in the garage where Brian worked was often vulgar. His coworkers made explicit, demeaning jokes about their wives. It was more than Brian could stand, and he finally spoke up, questioning how they could carry on in such a manner and explaining that such conversation was offensive to him because of his religious beliefs. You can probably guess what happened next. Brian's coworkers turned their crude jokes on him, targeting Brian's wife instead of their own. He complained to his supervisors, but they took no action. It was too much, so Brian resigned. After he filed a claim of religious discrimination, the lower court granted summary judgment in favor of the company. The Supreme Judicial Court of Maine reversed that decision, explaining that whether a comment is of a religious nature or whether it occurred because of an individual's religious beliefs or would have not occurred but for the individual's religion is a question of fact that a jury should decide. Brian's case is a good reminder that sometimes it takes a jury of one's peers to sort through all the facts in order to defend an employee's religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, I want to talk about some things related to immigration and the wall that certainly affect those of us in the state of Texas, and especially our listeners here in Dallas. But before I do so, the immigration debate was really hot and heavy the other day. I don't know if you saw this, but I thought I would mention it before we get into the wall. And that is there was a kind of a couple of heated exchanges when you had, interestingly enough, the Secretary of Homeland Security, that's Kirstjen Nielsen, actually testifying before the Senate Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee. It is amazing they have these subcommittees, but nevertheless, one of the exchanges took place between Kirstjen Nielsen and Senator Patty Murray, who is from the state of Washington. Senator Murray wanted to know, what the Department of Homeland Security was doing other than detention in order to save taxpayer money. I get the sense that money wasn't the issue, but that was the excuse, just to say, why are we even detaining these individuals? But nevertheless, whatever the motivation is, Senator Murray wanted to know what else we're doing. So, again, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, said, well, they utilize ankle bracelets, but he also added that if they pick up repeat offenders of those crossing into the United States illegally, or if these are individuals that have been charged with a crime worthy of prosecution, then they turn them over to the federal marshals. And that ends any option for so-called alternative methods to detention. In other words, we're not going to continue to put these people in detention or even give them ankle bracelets if they are actually individuals that are repeat offenders by crossing the border many times, or they actually have committed a crime. We're just going to turn them over to the federal marshals. And she says that kind of ends the option of alternative methods of detention. So when the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, explained that no matter the method, the United States will deport those caught in the United States illegally. And at that point, Senator Murray jumps in and says, well, I know what your philosophy is. Cuts her off. I don't even know if you got the last word there. I had to look at the transcript to see what Kirstjen Nielsen was saying. I know what your philosophy was. And I got to love Kirstjen Nielsen, who is, again, the Secretary of Homeland Security, said, wait a minute, it's not a philosophy. It's the law Congress passed. And there you got this kind of mindset, I know what your philosophy is. You're going to get rid of them. You're going to deport them. That's not my philosophy. That's the law. That's what we're supposed to do. And so I think it illustrated something we've talked about before. Just because it's a law doesn't mean you have to do it. After all, there were laws in the books that the previous president and the previous attorney general didn't enforce. And as a matter of fact, the previous president even wrote an executive order saying we will not enforce deportation. So really, just because the law's in the book doesn't mean we have to follow it. And I thought it was an interesting interchange between the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, who, by the way, is really one of the most qualified individuals. It is amazing that these people put up with this kind of abuse. We've talked about this with Mike Pompeo. I mean, again, first in his class at West Point, and certainly first in his class at Harvard Law School editor, law journal editor, entrepreneur, member of Congress, CIA director, and then puts up with all this abuse because he was going to be attacked for being Secretary of State. Kirstjen Nielsen, you might say, well, who's she? Well, she used to serve under one of the chief of staffs, I think, under the Bush administration. She served for a while under the chief of staff under Donald Trump, but she also served in Homeland Security, comes in with very good credentials, Georgetown undergraduate degree in the diplomatic service, law degree, all the rest. And then just to put up with this is amazing that we have such talented people that are willing sometimes to go through the kind of abuse that they face. But nevertheless, that's another story, certainly for another day. But Donald Trump has said Wednesday that his administration will begin work on a section of the promised U.S.-Mexico border wall in San Diego. And that was requested, interesting enough, like the Board of Supervisors for San Diego, which is California's second most populous county, sits on the border with Mexico. In April, by the way, the Board of Supervisors voted to support Donald Trump's legal challenge to the state that designated itself as a sanctuary state. So on the one hand, you've got the governor, Jerry Brown, and many others in his administration who have been hostile to Donald Trump. But now you have the Board of Supervisors who are living there, dealing with the consequences, and said, we're welcoming you to build the wall. And so, again, Donald Trump told reporters, San Diego has asked us to go forward with their section of the wall in California rather than not doing that and letting them lobby for us with Governor Brown. We decided to do it. And that leads to another piece that has come out more recently. Do walls make a difference? This piece that appeared in the Stream is really good because it reminds us that the border between the United States and Mexico is 1,900 miles long. And yet it really separates two major regions of the world with vastly different governments, vastly different standards of living, vastly different levels of crime. and you have about 1 million people who legally immigrate into the United States each year. You have 100 million year that visit each year, and more than 300,000 per year that legally overstay their visas. And so the question is, does a wall make a difference? Because, you have Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer saying, well, a wall can be tunneled under. I'm sure that those who love the wall have heard of shovels. It's a medieval solution to a modern problem. By the way, if you look at the wall they're building right there in San Diego, that thing is huge. I know you're not going over it, and I doubt you're going under it either as well. And so what this particular article does is it says, do walls work? Yes, as a matter of fact, since 2010, here's a list of nations that have either built, fortified, or expanded their border barriers. Austria, Kenya, Jordan, Spain, Greece, Norway, Slovenia, Macedonia, Gibraltar, Myanmar, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Oman, Algeria, Ukraine, Tunisia, Hungary, and Morocco, to mention just a few. And then it gives just incredible stories about when they replaced, for example, the old fencing with a modern pedestrian fencing near Nogales, Arizona, that the number of assaults on border agents dropped to almost nothing, a decline of about 81%. When they talk about putting the new fencing in urban sections of El Paso, Texas, quote, it has assisted in improving agents' ability to execute their METs. What's that? Mission Essential Task, resulted in higher apprehension rates in these areas. And then after they just simply put up vehicle fencing near Tucson, Arizona, that actually was able to reduce, quote, large amounts of illegal narcotics transported by motorized vehicles. Also was able to stop, quote, drive-throughs dropped by an average of 73%. And for those of you watching online, to use one example, I've been to Hungary this last year, and when you look at this chart, you will see, interestingly enough, all the migrants coming to Hungary, they built the wall, it's flat. I can show time and time again, story after story, of these kinds of charts. That one's for Egypt into Israel. And every one of these charts, even here's an Israeli example, what you end up finding out is that, guess what? Walls really do work. And so that's why one is going to be built in San Diego. You're going to hear the hue and cry from the governor, Jerry Brown, but at the same time, you have those individuals who the Board of Supervisors in the most populous county right now in the state of California saying, we welcome a wall so that we can bring about some kind of sanity in our community. Let's take a break, though. We have got a lot more to cover. Next hour, we're going to be talking with Scott Lively. We're going to talk about the Republican Party, Christian values, and how in the world did somebody like him even end up being in a primary in the state of Massachusetts. So we got a lot more to cover. And if you'd like to read some of the articles we've talked about, they're all available on our website, pointofview.net. Stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers, defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. A lot of things in the news. We'll get to those a little bit later, but let me just mention real quickly that, of course, on Tuesday, United States, through President Donald Trump, withdrew from the Iranian nuclear accord. There are a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is the president, even speaking there on Tuesday, said that it was defective at its core and had all sorts of explanations for why that was the case. Also, of course, you have the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who just a week ago really kind of bolstered the case by revealing intelligence that Iran was repeatedly lying to UN weapons inspectors about past nuclear activity. And so one of the articles we've posted, actually two of those, one entitled After Obama's Iran Deal, and another one, The Iran Deal is Dead, Now What? So we'll get to those a little bit later, some articles that we've posted today. Not surprising then, we've also seen the counter response from Syrian forces, in particular Iranian forces in Syria. You had about 20 rockets that were fired at Israeli military bases by the Iranian forces, and that led to a response from Israel in one of the largest direct clashes between Jerusalem and Tehran in recent memory, so we'll certainly have a chance to talk about that. And last night, again, the release of 3 Americans by North Korea, and the possibility that at least Vice President Mike Pence said of maybe possibly a breakthrough with the regime and what that might mean in the future. So we have a lot to cover, and I might just mention that in the next hour we're going to have in studio with us Darrell Bock. This new book out, Israel, the Church in the Middle East. We're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the nation of Israel in 1948. We'll talk about that today. We'll probably talk about it tomorrow on our weekend edition, and we'll be doing some special programming on it on Monday. But I wanted to bring to the microphone Dr. Scott Lively. He is a constitutional law attorney and pastor running for governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, he shocked everybody, by the way, in which they have their Massachusetts Republican convention, and he was able to win almost a third of the delegates. And so we're going to have a conversation today, not only about his campaign, but more importantly, since most of you do not live in the state of Massachusetts, just about the role of Christian values in a political party, in this case, the Republican Party. Some of us have in the past talked about where's the role for Christian values in some of the other parties. He holds a law degree from Trinity Law School, a doctorate in theology from the School of Bible Theology from the Pentecostal Assemblies of God, and joins us now by phone. Dr. Scott Lively, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
So good to be here with you.
I think you shocked a few people, maybe the, if you will, the Republican establishment in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, when last month you won almost a third of the delegates. How in the world did that happen?
Well, you know, I stand on a solid biblical worldview and platform, which is aligned with the National Republican Party to a large extent, but has been abandoned in Massachusetts for at least 3 decades. And there are quite a number of conservatives in Massachusetts, surprisingly enough, and they finally had somebody to vote for, and so that's the result.
You live in a state where either you have a Democratic governor, or you've had a William Weld or a Mitt Romney or people like that, or the current governor. But most of our listeners that are maybe not in the Northeast don't really understand, even in Massachusetts, kind of the division, because when you get outside of Boston proper, say, let's go to Western Massachusetts, you have a little more diversity than I think many of our listeners might expect. Can you explain that for us?
Well, Massachusetts is the Christian foundation of America. This was the home of the First Great Awakening. This was a powerhouse Christian state all the way up through the 1950s. It wasn't until the 1960s that it shifted to the left. And today, Charlie Baker, the current governor, in fact, what motivated me to challenge him in the primary is he promised to replace Planned Parenthood's money that they would lose from Congress because of their involvement in the baby parts harvesting and marketing scandal. And he was going to replace any money they lost with our state tax dollars. This is a Republican governor promising that to Planned Parenthood. And I said, that's enough. I mean, I've been putting up with this kind of stuff for a long time in Massachusetts because you just kind of get used to it. But that was the last straw for me. Somebody has to stand up for the Lord. Somebody has to stand up for the babies, biblical values, and I guess that's me.
Well, again, we have a link to your website, and one of the things I'll see is a little box there that says Save the Babies. Speak to that issue for just a minute, because, again, if you're going to find pro-life individuals, you're probably going to find them in the Republican Party. There are still a few pro-life Democrats, but very, very few. But at the same time, you are well aware of the fact that even within the Republican Party, sometimes you don't necessarily find a lot of pro-life individuals, especially if they're running in a place like the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. True?
Yes. And, well, here in Massachusetts, the Republican Party used to have parity with the Democrats, years ago. But after Weld came in and the party shifted to the left, the conservatives left, and they either became unenrolled voters or they stopped voting altogether. And right now, the party is down to an embarrassing, almost extinction level, 10.6% of the electorate. The Democrats are about 3 times that, but like 53% of the electorate are unenrolled, and it's this phenomenon. It's mostly conservatives who, and every time the Republicans put forward another liberal, it just solidifies their resistance to the Republican Party. We're changing that. We're turning it around. That's what my showing at the convention represents.
What would you say to some of our listeners, because we broadcast in 42 different states, and so there are some in California saying, okay, I can relate exactly what you're talking about here. I know we have listeners all over the North England area, so we've got people in New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine and Rhode Island, places like that, and Connecticut. Some of them are saying, this is the problem. I mean, this is not Mississippi. This is not Texas. This is not Kansas. This is a very different set of circumstances that I find myself in as a pro-life conservative. What would you say to some of those individuals?
Well, I'd say, it's not all that much different when you're talking about the establishment Republican Party. The reason that the National Party is so much more conservative is because of the grassroots. The establishment is leftist all over the country. I mean, look what happened in the last few Senate races. When an establishment candidate was challenged by a Tea Party guy. And the Tea Party people tend to be strong Christians. The establishment steps in, crushes them, and makes sure that their sort of much more liberal colleague gets reelected. And so all we have in Massachusetts is sort of like that phenomenon on steroids. But it's the same everywhere, and it's because, frankly, Christians have withdrawn from the political realm, with this idea that politics is dirty and we shouldn't be involved. But that's exactly the opposite of the feelings and philosophy of the founding fathers, and it's the reason why we had such stability and prosperity up through the 1950s, and then lost it in the 1960s when we changed our attitude.
Well said. That's one of the reasons we're talking about this today. What can we do to make a difference in our communities, in our state, and even in the nation? We have a lot more to talk about, and of course, along the way, we welcome your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Scott Lively with us. We'll continue right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
How accurate are fact checkers? Many fact-checking sites are tied to newspapers and others are independent operations. Often they provide a valuable service. Sometimes, though, the fact checkers need to be fact-checked. Such is the case with Snopes, which is one of the best-known fact-checking sites. Snopes did an analysis of one of the criticisms of California Assembly Bill 2943, which has been making its way through the legislature. The bill would prohibit the sale and distribution of books and counseling that is aimed at helping people overcome their same-sex attraction. One member of the California Assembly wondered, if this bill were to pass, would this prohibit the sale of the Bible that teaches these things about sexual morality? Snopes rejected the statement, saying that the bill does not mention the Bible, Christianity, or religion at all, and concluded the statement was demonstrably and clearly false. Robert Gagnon, writing in The Federalist, acknowledges the bill doesn't mention the Bible, but explains that it is irrelevant. He says, sure, it is virtually impossible that California will immediately attempt to ban the sale of the Bible itself. Not even the hard left in California has that kind of chutzpah. But citations of Bible verses in the context of declaring homosexual practice and transgenderism to be morally debased could indeed get one into serious trouble with the law if it comes in the context of selling or advertising a product or service. He concludes that Snopes heavily shades the truth. He then suggests read the bill. There is no religious exemption. There is no restriction to mental health professionals. This bill in the California legislature is much worse than the fact checker would have you believe. It may not ban the Bible, but it would certainly ban all sorts of books and counseling in the name of promoting the homosexual agenda. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today talking about the importance of Christian values and Christian involvement in the political process. And one of the examples we want to use is the involvement of Dr. Scott Lively, who is not only a pastor but also a constitutional law attorney and, of course, is running for the governorship in a primary. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But, Scott, let's, if we can, maybe get into the subject of education, because when we think about Massachusetts, we've had interviews before with people with mass resistance. But after all, you are in a commonwealth that was the first one through the Supreme Judicial Court to legalize same-sex marriage. And, of course, that then became national. But almost instantaneously then teaching a view about human sexuality, teaching a view that marriage could be one man and one woman or two men or two women or all sorts of other things. If that doesn't make a case for school choice, which I know is one of your platforms, I don't know what does. Speak to what is happening right now in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and why you believe we need something like choice.
Well, the problem of advocacy of the homosexual political agenda in public schools goes way back. It goes back to the 70s here in Massachusetts. And it was one of the first places they were using the pink triangle symbol, you know, the safe spaces, and Kevin Jennings and the
Yes.
Gay Straight Alliance Network and all of that. This is sort of ground zero for a lot of that. Massachusetts and California really are the two poles, the two bluest states. And Massachusetts, I think, leads California in advocacy of these issues. But once they came through, and I don't recognize, I don't recognize the idea that it was legalized. You cannot legalize something that is an institution created by God. civil government has no authority to redefine marriage. I simply don't recognize quote-unquote gay marriage as having any validity whatsoever. But in the area of school choice, my proposal is homeschool. That we should emphasize homeschool above every form of education. It produces the strongest and most academically strong and sound young people, and then private schools secondarily. And I think there's opportunity for partnerships between the private schools and Christian homeschooling primarily, but you don't have to be Christian to homeschool. And that the public schools should be drained of their funding. You know, the reason they're so focused on what they're doing is it's all about the money from the federal treasury. In fact, that's the secret of the left all over the country, especially wherever the Democrats have a real strong hold. They posture as being people concerned about the disadvantaged. They then demand money from the government to take care of the disadvantaged. And then this is money they control, and they use that money to build a giant infrastructure of entitlement programs that's staffed with permanent socialist voters that are organized in public employee unions. And then they pay them off with negotiated contracts between the government employees and the government officials. And so it's sort of like a self-perpetuating system that looks almost impossible to break. But the way you break it is that you drain them of the money. You take the kids out of the public schools so they're not getting that revenue, and that forces them to have to shrink and downsize. And as you do that, you demand local control over education, and you simply create it through the process of homeschool networks, private education, charter schools, and you put the squeeze on the government school system and force changes just through economic pressure.
You know, one of the other things that relates very closely to that is the issue of parental rights, and I know you speak to that issue as well, because the assumption that is made, at least in some of these states, is that children really are the wards of the state, and parents really have no rights. And you've seen that in the Commonwealth, and listeners in many of the other states that are listening have seen this as well, where under the guise of child protective services trying to protect the child, they, in some cases, have a legitimate case because there has been abuse, but in many other cases, we've talked about a situation where it is simply a way to usurp the rights of the parents. What are your thoughts?
Exactly. Well, you know, I was in Moscow in 2013 for the Planning Committee for World Congress of Families conference, which actually never came together because of international political activities. But I had the opportunity to meet with a Russian intellectual there that had just finished a big writing project in which he had talked about family policy in the Soviet Union and exposed that just about everything that we have here in our society that we're struggling against in the educational system, with marriage policy, with sexuality, was all instituted in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. No-fault divorce, the idea that the government has authority over the children, not the parents, abortion on demand, all these things were Soviet policies in the 20s. And that what's happened over the course of these many decades is that cultural Marxism has infiltrated our society and has simply taken over many of the institutions. And it's not the classic economic Marxism as much as it is the social issue cultural Marxism. But that's what rules. It's secular humanism, is the religion of Marxism. Political correctness is sort of like the value system of secular humanism. It's all Marxist at its core, and it's all about destroying the family structure and replacing it with this socialist utilitarian fantasy that they've always operated from.
Well, again, you've been a pastor, so speak to this for just a minute. Part of the problem is that you have a number of Christians that sort of uncritically accept all of that. And it seems to me that I'm sure you have maybe as a pastor preached about this from the pulpits. And I know you're familiar with the concept of the Black Regiment during the Revolutionary War. But it does seem to me that sometimes the problem is that the church isn't educated about these issues because the pastors aren't teaching on those topics. Would you agree?
Well, no, I think that what we're dealing with is fear. We're dealing with fear of man instead of fear of God in the clergy. They know what's going on. They don't want to address it, and it's a phenomenon. We have 3 generations of Americans who have been grown up under a completely secular humanist public education system. That's where most of our pastors come from. And even though they may be Christian and they may be have on a religious track, what they're actually practicing is a form of sort of Christian-flavored secular humanism, in which they're functional atheists in many ways in the way that they operate. A real Christian with a biblical worldview recognizes that God is sovereign over all spheres of society. There is no compartmentalization in Christianity in which you simply ignore the encroachment of sin, that it is destroying your neighbors, and that you just simply sit back or ghettoize yourself inside your church walls. That's not biblical Christianity. That's a sort of a hybrid between humanism and Christianity. And that's what the real danger is that's happening in society today. It's a lack of a true biblical perspective in which the Bible defines the identity of the Christian.
Let's see if we can take a break, and when we come back, we will open up the phones, give you a chance to join our conversation. We've talked about a few issues. We've talked about life and family and education. We'll also want to get into the Second Amendment. Those are certainly some issues. And Scott Lively is running to end moral and political corruption in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So we'll talk about corruption and a couple of other very important issues as well. And so if you'd like to join the conversation today, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'd love to get your comments. And even, of course, if you don't live in the state of Massachusetts, most of you probably do not, maybe you appreciate some of the comments coming from an individual who's both a pastor and an attorney, and an individual that decided to run for government. And maybe this would encourage some of you to do the same. Let me also mention that as you go to the website, you'll find a link to his website today. And my Viewpoints commentary is on fact-checking, has to do with our friends out there in California right now, a bill that's made its way through the California Assembly, and that is something that we've talked about as well, Assembly Bill 2943. So if you'd like to join the conversation today, we have a lot more to cover, and if you'd like to know more about this campaign by Scott Lively, or also read many of his pieces, his articles, his issues, his news, and some of the resources, all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. Again, our phone number, 1-800-351-1212. We also broadcast not only, of course, on our various radio stations and on our website, but also through the Facebook Live post, and some of you can leave some comments there if you'd like to do so. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about how to apply your Christian principles to the political process, we have information on our website, and we have information on Scott Lively's website as well. Let's take a break. We'll start taking those calls as well, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Scott Lively with us, and if you'd like to join us, we would love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Georgia first on the Good News Network. Jacob, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
How are you?
Very, very good. What's your comment?
Hi, Jacob. Hey, I just wanted to express a concern about the politician from Massachusetts saying the answer to public education or fixing some of the problems is taking students out of the schools in order to remove funding. What is his proposed solution, or what are your thoughts on the students that are not able to attend a private school or attend a charter school, or parents don't have the ability to homeschool them? What is your solution or thoughts on those students? Because it seems to me like if a lot of kids left, it would, the students that were not able to do that would be left without an option that suited their religious beliefs or whatever.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that actually is one of the talking points of the teachers' unions whenever you bring up school choice, is that it's going to drain people from the public schools and et cetera, et cetera. That's a phony argument. There's plenty of money to take care of all those kids that really need, special needs kids and all that, if we just simply shrink the bloated educational bureaucracy. It's just simply a false choice that they're offering. Optimally, what we need is local control of education. This idea of a national education, and it really isn't even national, this is international. And many of the standards that are being imposed on our kids all across America are actually coming from the United Nations, not coming even from the American educational bureaucracy. This is globalism, and it's being pushed from the very top, and it's all about creating groupthink among all of the students that are sitting in those classrooms. And that unless we look what they've done to America over the past few generations with their leftist control of the public school system. We haven't seen prayer in public schools since 1963. And before 1963, we didn't see school shootings. We didn't see the kind of phenomenon right now where these kids, these children today that are going to public schools today have never known a society in which their peers were not being slaughtered in abortion clinics, and that their peers are not being killed by other students in the classroom. They're living in a culture of barbarism that is a direct consequence of abandoning the perspectives of the Founding Fathers and embracing a Marxist worldview and the idea that the schools can supplant the parents as the primary educators and guides to those kids. We have got to break their stranglehold, and we have got to bring back local control, parental control of the school system. And that can be done. We need public education, but we need public education that's actually teaching an authentic American perspective, not a Soviet communist one.
Well, and again, let's get to local control for just a minute. Even in your own state, I would think education's different in Springfield, Massachusetts than it is in Boston. But certainly if you look nationwide at some of the places where we broadcast, education in Tupelo, Mississippi is very different than Detroit, Michigan, and very different than Peoria, Illinois, and very different than, say, Stockton, California. So in some respects, you have to understand that there needs to be local control just because the needs are so much different, aren't they?
Yeah, well, the basics are the same everywhere. I mean, we're all in this together, and the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic and all those things are, they're common everywhere.
Sure.
How to live in a family, how to be a good member of society. Those things are pretty universal. But instead of those things being taught, we have the gay agenda being crammed down all their throats, the promotion of, this March for Your Lives, phenomenon of trying to push an anti-Second Amendment agenda on all the kids. This is just simply the exploitation of the youth and the brainwashing of kids into a secular humanist worldview and perspective. It's intentional, it's purposeful, and it is happening all across. Look at Common Core. Common Core is another step in the direction of unifying and making universal the basic essentials of this system of groupthink. And it's very dangerous stuff, and we're seeing the consequences of it all around us. Homeschooling is the best way to avoid it, and in which we homeschooled our kids from K through 12. It's the best thing we ever did for them. And you can guide your children. You know, you're the person, you're the people, mom and dad are the people that God gave those children to train them in the way that they should go. You see the character qualities that they have, their natural interests, and you can facilitate them becoming the person God wants them to be, not the person that some educational bureaucrat wants them to be.
Let me, if I can, since you mentioned school shooting just a minute ago, last week we had the NRA convention just down the road from where we are here, and 87,000 plus came, so obviously NRA is not going away anytime soon. But if I remember right, I think in the state, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you are allowed to arm teachers. Talk about the Second Amendment and even how that might relate at all to the subject of education.
Well, I'm a very strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I believe Americans should be the best armed and trained people in the world. The criminals and the terrorists should be the ones afraid to go out their doors, not our family members. And in Massachusetts, the right to keep and bear arms has always been a well-respected right until Charlie Baker came along, the person that I'm running against. Charlie Baker has actually, as a Republican, has actually created the context for gun confiscation. He's in league with the lesbian Attorney General Maura Healey, who just on her own put forward a policy that banned certain types of rifles, and which was upheld by a federal judge that claimed that Justice Antonin Scalia would have been proud of him, which is just an absolute misrepresentation. Yes, the Second Amendment is still reasonably strong here in Massachusetts, but it's being encroached upon here and everywhere. And unless you have strong Republican leadership, because the Democrats they've gone south on this, decades ago. But unless you have strong Republican leadership, there is no resistance to the leftist agenda that's meaningful.
Let's take some more phone calls, and we'll go to Alabama this time. Ken, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Dr. Scott Lively.
Thank you, Kirby. A couple of quick questions. It might be just slightly off topic, but number one, did Mr. Trump mention maybe during his campaign that he might try to eliminate the Department of Education? I think. And number two, what about Ms. DeVos, that's head of the Department of Education? Wasn't she at least one time in favor of Common Core? I don't know if Dr. Duke Pesta's ever been on Point of View, but he's been to Birmingham to speak, and you can see him on YouTube. Dr. Pesta has spoke quite at length about all of the tremendous problems with Common Core.
Well, I'm in favor of President Trump ending the Department of Education. Conservatives have been talking about that, I think, all the way back to Goldwater. I'm not sure who it was that first introduced that, but it's an unnecessary system. Really, everything is upside down in America right now when it comes to public policy. The vision of the Founding Fathers was local control, that everything was dictated by local control, and the federal government was supposed to be dictated by the states. That it was federalism. The whole idea is that it's limited, delegated powers, and in education, the education should be handled at the community level, where the people who care most about those kids, their parents, and their neighbors, are the ones looking out for them and guiding them in the way that they should go.
Right, exactly. And I don't believe the word education is ever mentioned anywhere in our Constitution, if I remember correctly. So,
that's right. And go ahead.
No, that's all I had. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, again, just a good point or two.
Yeah.
Well, again, we need to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about maybe one or two other issues. Welfare reform is something we've been talking about as well. And again, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you have areas that certainly can be improved if we want to begin to help inner city families, what can be done there. And again, part of the reason we're doing this is, again, I recognize most of you don't live in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but I thought it might be encouraging, if nothing else, to hear of a pastor running for office who also understands some of these issues and certainly is calling for Christian values to return back to the political arena. So often some of you say, well, I'll just leave that to the professional politicians. How's that working for you? That hasn't worked very well, and certainly some of you have said, well, I'll vote every 4 years, but other than that, I'm not going to get involved in this messy thing called politics, and that's exactly why we find ourselves in the circumstance we find ourselves in today. So let's take a break, and let me just mention that one of the resources that I've made available is a book, a little booklet called Making Your Vote Count, and if you haven't had a chance to get a copy of that, we still make that available here at Point of View. Gives you just a little bit more of an encouragement and incentive to be a good citizen, and that's what we're talking about today with Dr. Scott Lively. We'll take a break, and by the way, we'll take some more phone calls after the break. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Brian Fenimore is described as a fundamentalist Christian. He worked for a hydroelectric company in Bangor, Maine. Everyone there knew he was a Christian, and that's where the problems seemed to begin. The talk in the garage where Brian worked was often vulgar. His coworkers made explicit, demeaning jokes about their wives. It was more than Brian could stand, and he finally spoke up, questioning how they could carry on in such a manner and explaining that such conversation was offensive to him because of his religious beliefs. You can probably guess what happened next. Brian's coworkers turned their crude jokes on him, targeting Brian's wife instead of their own. He complained to his supervisors, but they took no action. It was too much, so Brian resigned. After he filed a claim of religious discrimination, the lower court granted summary judgment in favor of the company. The Supreme Judicial Court of Maine reversed that decision, explaining that whether a comment is of a religious nature or whether it occurred because of an individual's religious beliefs or would have not occurred but for the individual's religion is a question of fact that a jury should decide. Brian's case is a good reminder that sometimes it takes a jury of one's peers to sort through all the facts in order to defend an employee's religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back a few more minutes. Scott Lively with us, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Scott, let me, if I can, talk about welfare for just a minute. We've talked about welfare reform and the idea of a work requirement. We have spent lots and lots of money, around numbers, if you look at both federal spending and state and local spending, almost $1 trillion a year. And the percentage of individuals in poverty is essentially the same as when Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty. Now, I recognize poverty in the 21st century is a little different than poverty in the 20th century. Most individuals that are under the poverty line still have air conditioning, may have a car, certainly have a cell phone, and a variety of other things. But Obviously, this is a classic example. If you want to do something different, you have to stop doing the same thing year after year and spending $1 trillion every single year for something that doesn't seem to be working.
That's right. Well, you know, the Democrat Party has always been about slavery. It was African slavery in the old days. It's the slavery of the poor and the disadvantaged today. Everything is about the money. It's all about every person that they can turn into a permanent government dependent is a little income stream from the federal treasury and sometimes from the state treasury too, but it's primarily the federal treasury because all these entitlement programs are federal. And so if you're on the list, if you're homeless or if you're a heroin addict or you're any one of a number of different categories that are within the welfare definitions, then you become an income stream for the hard left, and they use that money, like I said before, to create these massive entitlement programs staffed with permanent socialist voters, which are organized in public employee unions, and that's a self-perpetuating system. What the solution to that is to break primarily inner city families free from government dependency. And the Republicans are perfectly oriented and suited toward that if we just simply apply entrepreneurialism and our care and our actual care for the people that are struggling to help the people in the inner cities establish their own financial freedom, not by getting jobs, right? That's the other side of the scam here. The elite system on the left, it's big government. On the right, it's big corporations. And it's sort of this predatory corporate style in which people become essentially wage slaves, to use sort of a leftist term. And so that's the choice you have in the inner city. You're either going to be on the leftist plantation or you're going to be on the plantation of these multinational corporations. Why don't the people in the inner cities own the buildings that they're living in? Why aren't they running the businesses that provide the essentials that they need every day, the grocery stores and the restaurants and the furniture stores? It's because no one has ever assisted them and taught them the essentials of entrepreneurialism, because the Democrats haven't wanted that, and many of the people themselves haven't wanted it because for many it's an easy life, just simply taking a government check. But it's debilitating, and it's morally degrading to live that way. And my wife and I run an inner city mission. We founded in 2008 an inner city mission in Springfield. I worked with these people. I know most of them do not want to be enslaved to government dependency. They want to have some kind of something to live for, other than just going down and picking up a check. And Republicans can solve this problem. And I'm going to set the example of doing it here in Massachusetts.
Let me, if I can, since you were talking about that in terms of a mission, it does seem to me that that's a really important role for the church. And it's something that the church is sometimes backed out of. One, because there has been the federal government moving in or the state government moving in, and two, because sometimes they've been prevented by various kinds of rules and regulations. True?
That's exactly right. And our mission, it's Redemption Gate Mission Society, because I'm a Christian attorney, I create my own entities when I need one. And I created the Redemption Gate Mission Society. It's a church that has the appearance of a coffee house. So we don't want to, we want an environment which people who wouldn't otherwise go to church feel comfortable. But it's a center of spiritual activity, and it reaches the most disadvantaged in society, the mentally ill, drug addicts, homeless, all of them. And we help to lift them up spiritually and promote the concepts of self-sufficiency, dignity, living a biblical worldview. And that has changed the lives of many people. And that's the kind of thing that the church should be involved in, not just giveaway programs, right? That doesn't help anybody. Yes, you feed them for a day, but if you teach them how to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. And the church has fallen into this trap of just of the feel-good thing, of passing out clothes and passing out food and all that, every Thanksgiving or every Easter or something, instead of getting in and doing the hard work of helping the people that are in this government dependency trap to be liberated from it by learning life skills that they just don't get in the culture that they're in. How to balance a checkbook, and what does it mean to, how do you actually, operate a simple business. And we do better in Africa than we do here in the United States, microfinancing and all those kinds of things. And that we can bring those things to bear here in America. And for every person that we break free of government dependency, we are liberating the taxpayers of the burden of having to cover all of their expenses, and we turn them into taxpayers themselves.
Well, again, a lot of material that is available on your website. One last time, just before we let you go, talk about some of the resources. We've talked about a couple of those, and if nothing else, appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View. But what will people find when they land on your website?
Yeah, it's votelively.com. What you'll find is just various different solutions to different social problems, and a clear example of biblical advocacy in the political context, something that you don't see very often. I'm a strong supporter of President Trump. I believe he was transformed from a somewhat reprobate New York liberal into the man of God, that God's man in the White House today. I saw the transformation myself, spiritual confirmation in sort of endorsement of the idea. But he has shown the example of speaking boldly and not being intimidated and not backing down on the things that are important and essential. And if Christians would just simply follow that model and don't fall into another trap that we have of thinking you have to be perfect in order to stand up in the public realm. You don't. The Bible, the only examples of Christians in political life, they're not in the New Testament, which is mostly regulates church life and sort of individual personal behavior. It's the Old Testament, which is full of examples of real human beings operating in the world in a way that God approves of, even if they're not perfect. So that's the standard that we should be promoting. That's what I'm trying to set an example of myself. Be brave in the face of persecution. Stand strong on essential truths, whether or not you're being mocked for them. And when you do that, it changes things. That's how America will be restored. That's how America will be made great again, by the people who hold these values, articulating them, and not running away just because someone calls them a hater or a homophobe or whatever.
Well, Scott, appreciate you giving us some time today. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we have Dr. Darrell Bock in studio with us today. He is the co-editor of a new book, Israel, the Church, and the Middle East. And as we are starting to gear up for some of the conversation we want to have about the 70th anniversary of the nation of Israel, thought this would be a conversation you would want to have with him, and certainly we do welcome your phone calls as well. We've got information about our two guests on our website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break and come back with Dr. Darrell Bock in studio right after this.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time talking about Israel, and there are a couple of very good reasons for that. Coming to the 70th anniversary of the founding of the nation of Israel, but also this new book, Israel, the Church, and the Middle East. We have, as I've been mentioning, in studio with us today, Dr. Darrell Bock, individual that we've known for many years, has been on the program. He is now the Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at the Hendricks Center, also the Senior Research Professor in New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary, author of 40 books, and also the host of the Table Podcast, which keeps you very busy as well, doesn't it?
It sure does, and you got that all done in one breath. That was impressive.
Well, I'll do my best. Let's work our way through that for a minute before we talk about the book. First of all, I am a real fan of the Table Podcast. I've been on it a few times. I've watched many others. You could spend most of your life just trying to watch them, because you've built up, 200 hours worth?
200 hours worth of material in a little over 5 years. Yeah.
And again, it is a veritable who's who, all the professors at Dallas Seminary, but all the individuals that come to Dallas Seminary who are individuals that will speak in the chapels, and then you have a few that you do with various Skype and other things. Just a phenomenal resource on any theological, cultural topic you can possibly imagine. So if people are interested, they can go to Dallas Seminary or go directly to the Table Podcast, can't they?
That's right. Voice is, I think, dts.edu/the table will get you there. It's all one word in the URL. And our little opening is welcome to the table. We discuss issues of God and culture intersect in a lot of places, because he's in a lot of places.
And I remember when the president, Mark Bailey, who's been on the program with us many times before, suggested, well, are you sure you're going to have enough topics? And I think you have found the same thing with the podcast that I have with Point of View.
Right.
When you start talking about the interface of faith with culture, there are so many topics you can't possibly cover all of them.
That's correct, and they also the deck shuffles occasionally, so that sometimes there's a whole new angle on things as a result of things that happen. So we actually have a list in our office that is probably a couple of pages long that we haven't even gotten to yet.
Yes.
So it's actually fun, because you cover a wide array of things. We do apologetics topics. We've done all kinds of LGBTQ kinds of conversations. We've done spousal abuse. We've got a series on world religions. We've taken a trip through the Nicene Creed. I mean, it's fun and challenging, and I love doing it.
Well, again, it is well done, and again, I recommend it, and you can find that at dts.edu. Of course, we have some of the links here, and we also have a link to this new book, Israel, the Church, and the Middle East. Before we get into the book, there is also a tie to Lifeway and a survey, as well as organizations that come out of it. Can you speak to that for just a minute?
Yeah, what happened was we were in the process of producing the book. This is the fifth book that Mitch Glaser and I have done together related to some topic tied to Israel and the Jewish roots of Christianity and that kind of thing. And so we had the chapters assigned, the chapters being written, and then Mitch got together with Joel Rosenberg, and they commissioned together a study of the state of Messianic Judaism and Judaism in the United States. And that survey showed that a lot of people don't quite know what to do with Israel, and particularly the younger you get, the less they know what to do. And part of that, the way I explain it to people is that, when I grew up, or when we grew up, the 67 war and then everything that having to do with the establishment of Israel in the Middle East was kind of a given and just a shock to the world that Israel had survived this and that kind of thing. And the defining event in the Middle East for younger people is 9/11.
Yeah.
And so that's a completely different part of the Middle East, a completely different set of issues, et cetera. And Israel kind of got lost in the shuffle. And so the question became, what do we think of Israel, its role in the Middle East? What's its role in Scripture? And then, of course, you have the theological discussion that happens among Christians about what the role of Israel is in Scripture. And those two things have rendered people less certain about how Israel fits into the scheme of things. And we just thought that's a change that's actually not healthy for the church. And so we wanted to address it. So we formed an organization called Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem. And our goal is really to produce materials and educate people about the role of Israel in Scripture and do so in a way that we think is balanced. In other words, it's not just a pro-Israel group, although it is an explanation for why we think Israel has a right to the land and that kind of thing, but it also is interested in issues of justice and reconciliation in the region, and the point that the gospel and the hope of the gospel is ultimately about reconciliation between people who normally are at war with one another, and how Christ can bring people together. So it's not a national Zionist kind of thing, although it is a pro-Israel organization.
You know what, you mentioned just a minute ago, we do a millennial roundtable on Wednesdays, and I've noticed the real difference, because those of us a little bit older, and I count myself as one of the older ones, we remember a time when Israel was threatened at every level, whether it's Yom Kippur War, whatever it might be, and so it was kind of like David and Goliath. But then now, this younger generation, they hear more about the Palestinian problem. They hear about
That's
Gaza,
right.
whatever, and it's almost reversed the kind of perceptions. And so, again, there's a real important to educate, which is why I think this book is so valuable.
That's right, and that is the goal. And like I say, the goal is to try and produce some balance, also produce some explanations. Some of them are theological, some of them are more social, political, and legal. There's a mix in the book that you wouldn't normally see in a book like this. And so we're trying to cover as much ground as we can in the midst of discussing things. There's even chapters that cover the Palestinian Christian presence in the region, that kind of thing.
Well, I might just mention, part 1 is on biblical foundations. Part 2 is theology in the conflict. Number 3, Yeshua and the midst of the crisis, which gets into some of that, the Messianic Jewish movement and the Palestinian church and those kinds of things. Then part 4, the current challenges to peace in Israel, of which there are many,
yes,
as well as the Lifeway Survey. So it's just a great resource. But let me get into the biblical foundation. Maybe, in fact, in a minute, maybe we'll come back to that, because I want to get into the foundations, because you know as well as I do that some people say, well, is there a place for Israel anymore? Has the church supplanted Israel? And that's an important issue. And so let me just, before we take a break here, again, encourage you to get some of this information, first of all, about the book, but also about Darrell Bock, because as he is working in the Hendricks Center, there are some great resources, not the least of which is the Table Podcast. And for our Dallas listeners, I might mention, you're going to do an event in the future, aren't you?
Yeah, we're a year away from a gala. We have a 30-year anniversary that we're celebrating in year 33 because we can't count.
Yes.
And so it's an inner joke with us, but we're calling it Hendricks Center 2.0. We're talking about what we've been and where we're headed, because we really have developed as a center, as an extension of the seminary and the things that we're concerned about, and we're having Tim Keller come in, and then we're going to do a Faith and Work conference with Tim Keller and Tom Nelson of Kansas City, who works with Made to Flourish, and have people think about their discipleship during the week and the way they view their work.
So again, those are some other resources coming up. When we come back, though, we'll get into some of the biblical foundations. Israel, the Jewish people, and God's covenant. Also, Walt Kaiser's been with us before on Israel and her neighbors, Israel and the story of the Bible, with Mark Yarbrough, who's been in studio with us as well. And then the hermeneutics of the conflict. And then we'll get into some of the other issues as well, including some questions about should Christians even support the nation of Israel? That's a question answered by Mark Bailey. So lots to cover. Craig Parshall's been with us before, some of the legal challenges. So we got a lot to cover in the next hour. We'll do our best right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
How accurate are fact checkers? Many fact-checking sites are tied to newspapers and others are independent operations.
Often they provide a valuable service. Sometimes, though, the fact-checkers need to be fact-checked. Such is the case with Snopes, which is one of the best-known fact-checking sites. Snopes did an analysis of one of the criticisms of California Assembly Bill 2943, which has been making its way through the legislature. The bill would prohibit the sale and distribution of books and counseling that is aimed at helping people overcome their same-sex attraction. One member of the California Assembly wondered, if this bill were to pass, would this prohibit the sale of the Bible that teaches these things about sexual morality? Snopes rejected the statement, saying that the bill does not mention the Bible, Christianity, or religion at all, and concluded the statement was demonstrably and clearly false. Robert Gagnon, writing in The Federalist, acknowledges the bill doesn't mention the Bible, but explains that it is irrelevant. He says, sure, it is virtually impossible that California will immediately attempt to ban the sale of the Bible itself. Not even the hard left in California has that kind of chutzpah. But citations of Bible verses in the context of declaring homosexual practice and transgenderism to be morally debased could indeed get one into serious trouble with the law if it comes in the context of selling or advertising a product or service. He concludes that Snopes heavily shades the truth. He then suggests, read the bill. There is no religious exemption. There is no restriction to mental health professionals. This bill in the California legislature is much worse than the fact-checker would have you believe. It may not ban the Bible, but it would certainly ban all sorts of books and counseling in the name of promoting the homosexual agenda. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have in studio with us today Dr. Darrell Bock of Dallas Theological Seminary and also of the Hendricks Center, and he is again the Executive Director for Cultural Engagement. The book is entitled Israel, the Church, and the Middle East, and let's talk about some of these biblical foundations. This is where, Darrell, I think there's some miscommunication. Some people say, well, there was a place for Israel in the Old Testament, but now we're in the New Testament. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's called replacement theology. It's also called supersessionism. The people who hold to it call it fulfillment theology, so you can already tell when you got three names for the same thing, you got controversy.
Yes.
And the argument is that the church has replaced Israel in the plan of God and has replaced Israel permanently, basically, is the idea. And the book is designed to say, no, that's not quite right, that if you actually look at the covenant commitments that God made to Israel, those are irrevocable covenants that God made. These are eternal covenants that last for the people. And yes, the church has a role in the plan of God. And yes, Jesus is the fulfillment of those promises. But as Messiah of Israel, he himself held out hope for the nation of Israel, as did the Apostle Paul. And so Israel still has a place in the plan of God that shouldn't be neglected, because it's actually part of the demonstration of God's faithfulness and God's goodness and God's grace, and the fact that we don't earn our salvation.
Well, again, these covenants, as you said, are not revocable. They're irrevocable.
That's
and
right.
So whether we're talking about the Noahic covenant or the Moses covenant or the Abrahamic covenant or whatever it might be, these are still very important in the New Testament. True?
Yeah. I like to distinguish between what I call the covenants of promise, which are which is the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the New covenant. Abrahamic covenant promised a nation out of the seed of Abraham that also promised ultimately a Messiah out of the seed of Abraham. and that the people who bless the seed of Abraham will be blessed, and the people who curse the seed of Abraham will be cursed. And then the Davidic covenant is a covenant that promises a Messiah, a line, a dynastic line out of the house of David. And the new covenant promises forgiveness and the Spirit, or the law written on the heart, and other prophets talk about the Spirit being placed inside of us. And those three covenants actually work together. And when we get to the book of Galatians in chapter 3, we see how these are combined, how the promise to Abraham and the promise of the Spirit are combined through the work of the Messiah. All three covenants are operating simultaneously, and that blessing gets extended to Gentiles so that Gentiles can be called seed of Abraham as well. But Gentile inclusion does not mean Israelite exclusion. And so because you include Gentiles in the promise and in the scope of the promise doesn't mean that the commitments that God made to the people of Israel have been lost.
One of the questions I get, and I know this is maybe beyond the book, but it has to do with the book of Revelation, because when you get past about the third or fourth chapter, it's really Jewish, isn't it?
That's right.
And so what about that? Is there a place for the Jews in that time as well?
Yeah, in fact, the point of Romans 9 to 11, just to connect the dots, is Paul says, the people who were originally part of the tree of blessing have been cut out, and you've been grafted in, speaking to Gentiles. But there's coming a time when those who were original part of the tree will be grafted back in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. So he's anticipating a time in which many Jewish people will respond to the Messiah, embrace the Messiah, and come back into the blessing that does come through Christ. There's no doubt about that, but the anticipation is the reconciliation, which the gospel has always been designed to show between Jew and Gentile, will be demonstrated in the end time with Jew and Gentile being one in Christ, and that will be more than the current remnant that Paul writes about of faithful Jews who believe in the current period when he was writing, and even believe today.
Well, again, that's part of the biblical foundations. Of course, you have some material on the hermeneutics of the conflict and Israel and the story of the Bible. But I'll keep it moving a little bit, because one of the other sections deals with the theology of Israel and the church. Craig Blazing, who I know you've co-authored various resources with as well, and some of the Israel and the land of the writings of the church. How about we think through that particular issue?
Well, the issue of several of these chapters is designed to show that this isn't just a hope about the fact that Jewish people as an ethnicity are going to come and believe, but actually there's a role for the nation, there's a role for the land, and so, for example, the chapter by Walt Kaiser talks about passages like Isaiah 2 and Isaiah 19, and these picture the nation streaming to Jerusalem to worship God, or a highway built from Egypt to Assyria that runs through Israel, and people are going to be streaming. It's like an interstate. People will be streaming to Jerusalem to come and worship God together. And so these chapters are designed to show that even though we have the New Testament, in fact, in Acts 3, Peter says, at the times of restoration, if you want to know what the times of restoration look like, read your Hebrew Scriptures, read the Old Testament, because it tells you what those times are going to be like. And there's no indication that anything has changed significantly from those descriptions. And Peter got the benefit of what I call the 40-day ultimate use of the Old Testament in the New Era class from Jesus himself, as he explained how the Old Testament scriptures worked and how the plan of God was working.
Wow. So again, a lot of it in this book, Israel, the church, and the Middle East. And one of the other sections you have is dealing with the Messianic Jewish movement today. Of course, you've been to Israel many times, and of course, another part of that is this whole alliance for the peace of Jerusalem. So speak to that issue, because if you're a Messianic Jew in Israel, you're kind of a persona non grata sometimes, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, there's more religious liberty in Israel than there's anywhere else in the Middle East. That's important to say, but it is hard because you're surrounded by actually two other sets of Jewish people, one very Orthodox, traditional Jewish believers, very rooted in Torah, and then a very secular set of Jews. And both groups want little or nothing to do with Christianity. They've been told that a lot of the problems that Judaism has faced has come at the hands of Christians through history, some of which is true. And so it makes life as a Messianic very different. And Messianism in Israel is very different than Messianism here in the United States. I'm on the board of Chosen People Ministries, which is a ministry to the Messianic Jewish community, and it also designed to teach Gentiles how to talk to Jewish people about the faith. And And there are many Messianic congregations that are springing up. In fact, one of the findings in the survey that's pretty fascinating is that that many Christians have some Jewish background in their roots. That it's much more networked and much more extensive than people thought. In fact, there are more people who have connections in that way than there are Jews in the United States. And so that was a complete surprise. The number was about 3.5, 4 times what people thought. And so that means that most Christians have some relative, grandfather or father, somewhere in their family tree there is a Jewish presence. And that was a surprise. So we formed this alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem to discuss the biblical issues on the one hand and the nature of Messianism on the other, because another point that's important is allowing Messianic Jews to be both believers in Messiah and be Jewish as they reach out to other Jews, usually out of their family or whatever. So they oftentimes worship in what are called Messianic synagogues that meet on the Sabbath. They meet on a Saturday rather than a Sunday, that kind of thing, and allows the maintenance of some level of Jewish practice within the Jewish communities to which they are associated. And we see that actually in the New Testament. James has a reputation for having been a very Jewish-oriented believer. Mm-hmm. And so the problems came when you tried to make a Gentile into a Jew. Mm-hmm. That wasn't supposed. You didn't have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian if you were a Gentile. And so some of the book deals with some of these realities in the discussion of these communities.
And again, let me just mention, since you did mention in passing, Chosen People is a great organization that you are part of, at least set on the board, I understand. And we've mentioned that one and Jews for Jesus and a few others that are existent. So again, if you want to learn more about how to reach out to your Jewish friends, and almost all of us have Jewish friends, but we sometimes don't know what to say or how to say it, those are some great resources.
Yeah, you just Google Chosen People Ministries and they'll take you to the site and you'll be off and running with all kinds of potential resources for how to do that.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple of other controversial issues. What about the Palestinians, and should Christians support a modern state of Israel? But also, let me open up the phones. I suspect you have some comments or questions about Israel, and we are privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Darrell Bock. So let me give you that opportunity. 1-800-351-1212. We have information about this book, and it is published by Kriegel. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but I know that some of you might have difficulty finding it. So if you click on the button here, it will take you to a place where you can order it, and it is available in paperback. And Darrell Bock and Mitch Glazer are the editors, and I've mentioned just a few of the participants. That's just kind of a who's who of people we've interviewed on this program before that have written some of the chapters, and I think you'll find it very helpful as we talk about the 70th anniversary of the nation of Israel, and also talk about the importance of the nation of Israel, and the question we'll get to after the break. Should we support the nation of Israel, and how much should we, when sometimes there are questions about what Israel does? So we'll get into that, too, as well. So if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Also broadcasting on Facebook Live. If you want to leave a comment there, we'll read those on the air. All that coming up right after this.
Imagine you work where you know people do not share your faith, and they certainly don't agree with a Christian view of life and culture. You are surrounded by hostility every single day. How important would it be to have solid information to back you up? Jim in South Carolina listens to Point of View in the afternoons. He writes, I teach in a public secular university and enjoy actually being a voice for the biblical Christian worldview in a liberal setting. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for being bold and proclaiming truth. And Jim finishes, I pray for you daily. Jim works in hostile territory, and he prays for Point of View because Point of View is a source of truth. Please help us continue being here for Jim and everyone else. We need you to visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151 and join the Truth Team. Enable us to be here each day by giving each month. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Darrell Bock, again with Dallas Theological Seminary, and of course also with the Hendricks Center. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, talking about the book Israel, the Church, and the Middle East. And we'll take those calls in just a minute. But let's, if we can, get into the Palestinian issue for just a minute. We've had Dale Hansen-Burke on as well. She's written about this, the Christian-Palestinian issue. And on the one hand, we want to support the nation of Israel, but on the the other hand, that doesn't mean we support everything that they do. That's true of any country that we support. We recognize that we may disagree with our allies, but how do we think our way through this? You have a whole section here, the 21st Century Palestinian Church within Israel. Tom Doyle's been on the program with us, and he's written that article. How do we kind of think that through?
Well, that's a difficult discussion because I tell people when I travel to Israel, and I go periodically, in fact, I'll be there this summer, I inevitably end up on both sides of what's called the wall.
Yes.
I hear the same stories, only the good guys and the bad guys flip.
Yes.
And because there are issues of the way people have been treated going both ways, and everyone has good memories about those. And what I mean by good memories, I mean long memories they don't forget.
Yes.
And so that builds up the animosity, and there's a history of animosity, and in some cases there are injustices that need sometimes to be addressed. The harder part of this is that the reality is that Israel's in a very difficult position. When you have everyone around you, all your neighbors, who many of whom would like to see you exterminated, that's a difficult neighborhood to live in.
It is.
And so that is the hard part. I've actually spoken at a thing called Christ the Checkpoint, which is on the Palestinian side of Bethlehem and at Bethlehem Bible College, and I was asked to speak on what I thought about the region as a dispensationalist, and I went in and spoke on why I thought Israel had a right to the land. Took about 45 minutes to do that. Took almost an hour worth of questions afterwards. And then interacted. And one of the things I said to them is, I said, if everyone around you wanted to eliminate you, the issues of security would be important. And oftentimes in trying to protect yourself, you do things that, that may overstep the bounds, that kind of thing. So it's a hard region to deal with. I refer to it as this, it's like, and this is a trite way to describe it, but it's like putting their earphones in a computer bag and not taking care of them before. And inevitably, when you go to pull them out, it's all tangled up in a real mess, and it just takes a while to untangle it all.
Yeah.
And so that's the hard part. But you want to listen to what Palestinian Christians are saying and what their input is, because the church cares about any part of its body. And then you also want to realize that Palestinian Christians are in a difficult place because their Christianity in the midst of a significantly Muslim population is also a challenge.
It is.
So it's just a very difficult region. It's not an easy conversation, and that's why it has remained really a challenge for everyone in the region to figure out what to do for these many years.
Again, country that is about the size of New Jersey. If you've ever been to New Jersey, you realize how small that is.
Exactly
if you've ever
right.
been to Israel, as I have, and you have as well, you realize how small it is compared to millions of square miles surrounding it of hostile countries. So we'll take some calls around the way. Let's, if we can, go to California, KYCC. Ray, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hey, hi. I just want to say thank you, Kerby, for having me and your guests. Good to learn more about what's going on in Israel. As an American here, read the Word of God, which is an infallible word, and it tells us in Genesis 12:3 that, and I will bless them that bless thee, and I will curse him that curses thee, and they shall all the families of the earth be blessed. As Americans, we should be supporting Israel with prayer, with finances, to protect that country as well, no matter what's going on, because that's the word says. And as a job as an American, we're to, like I said, protect them and just bless them and keep going forward. And God will deal with it mightily, because it all starts with prayer.
Ray, appreciate that. That kind of is a setup for one of the pieces by Mark Bailey. Should Christians support the modern state of Israel? I think you could make some arguments at a number of different levels. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, basically the answer to that question, I think, is yes. I also think that it's important to understand how Israel supported herself in the midst of the Old Testament and how God supported Israel in the midst of the Old Testament, which is that he supported the nation. He would, obviously had helped plan it and establish it, etc. But he also surrounded the nation with prophets. And these prophets were self-critical. I sometimes say this about our own internal politics, that you can be pro-nation and yet still be critical of those places where the nation comes up short.
Of course.
And that is very, very important. So the idea that because I am pro-Israel or I'm pro-American policy related to Israel, doesn't mean that either American policy or Israel is beyond criticism in those places where it falls short of standards that the Bible holds up, because our top commitment as believers is to the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so the values that we have are important. So this means you want to give your support to Israel because you actually want to argue that when Israel doesn't do that which is right in relationship to other people, and the same would be true of Christians, we actually hurt the cause that we claim to espouse. And so this consistency is very important. So I like to distinguish between support for Israel, and that doesn't mean everything gets a rubber stamp, because that can actually lead you in a direction that in the end undercuts the credibility and the support you want to give.
Some of us are old enough to remember the old phrase that I disagreed with even at the time, my country right or wrong, during the Vietnam War, things like that. So, again, Ray, I appreciate that comment. One of the other pieces I want to get to before we take a break is by Craig Parshall, The Legal Challenges at the Nexus of the Conflict. Craig Parshall's been on this program, and, of course, his wife, Janet Parshall, one of the best talk show hosts in the business. But what about some of those legal issues? That's something we have not really talked about very much here on Point of View.
No, that's right. And when Mitch and I were laying out the template for the book, I said to him, at some point we've got to deal with the question, does Israel have a legal right to this land? Because there are a lot of people who aren't believers. They don't necessarily accept the Bible as the Word of God, etc. That's a lot of people in the world. So is there a legal justification for Israel's existence? So we asked Craig, who's a lawyer, to write up that chapter and to say, all right, so if we were strictly on secular ground, how would you make the argument for the nation of Israel? That's that chapter. And I don't know of another book of theology that discusses this that actually goes into that question. So I view this as actually one of the more important chapters in the book because it does set out the legal international grounds for why it is that Israel has the right to land. And that gets you into some of the justice issues, because one of the problems and challenges of the reality in the Middle East is when Israel declared independence and people were displaced as a result, how do you work through that situation legally? And how do you work through that situation actually at a strictly human level as well? Because obviously displacement is a very difficult thing to go through if you're on the receiving end of it. And the whole refugee problem in the Middle East started with that as part of what had generated it. So that's one of the issues that is actually one of the difficult remaining issues in the region.
Well, and again, this is, I think, helpful as a book because let's go back to supporting the nation of Israel. I can say to my non-Christian friends, even if you don't accept the Bible, certainly our best friend in the Middle East, at least the one that has anything that looks like a functioning democracy, is Israel.
That's right.
There are some very good reasons to support that, even apart from my biblical justification. Likewise, when we come to Craig Parshall's piece, you can make the case and really help to deal with this argument, well, Jews were never in the land, or, all the other kinds of things you get from Mahmoud Abbas and others. I think it's really a good piece because sometimes you're dealing with people who say, well, I don't accept your Bible, so do you got anything else? The answer is, I've got some other arguments.
Yep. Yeah, including UN recognition, which that makes some people nervous, but actually, from an international point of view, that's important. And so, one of the realities that people are going to have to deal with is Israel is there, it's in the land, it's established, it's been there now for 70 years, and in getting people to recognize that it has the right to be there, and both on theological and legal grounds is important. Of course, one of the controversies of the region is that some nations in the area have never accepted that fact.
Right.
And so that makes the region, again, it's a difficult region with a long history of debate. Some of these disputes have gone on for thousands of years. You don't create a problem over thousands of years and solve it in a couple of meetings.
No, you certainly don't. UN resolutions, of course, the whole moving of the embassy and a variety of other issues, but we need to take one of those breaks. We come back. Mike Brown has written a piece, Is It Sinful to Divide the Land of Israel? Again, you did not back off on any of the controversial issues, did you?
No, not at all.
Not at all. So we're going to take a break. We'll come back and deal with that as well. If you're just joining us, again, talking about the book, Israel, the Church, and the Middle East. I haven't done a very good job of opening up the phones. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment,
1-800-351-1212, or just simply sit back and listen to Darrell Bock. We'll do that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Brian Fenimore is described as a fundamentalist Christian. He worked for a hydroelectric company in Bangor, Maine. Everyone there knew he was a Christian, and that's where the problem seemed to begin. The talk in the garage where Brian worked was often vulgar. His coworkers made explicit, demeaning jokes about their wives. It was more than Brian could stand, and he finally spoke up, questioning how they could carry on in such a manner and explaining that such conversation was offensive to him because of his religious beliefs. You can probably guess what happened next. Brian's coworkers turned their crude jokes on him, targeting Brian's wife instead of their own. He complained to his supervisors, but they took no action. It was too much, so Brian resigned. After he filed a claim of religious discrimination, the lower court granted summary judgment in favor of the company. The Supreme Judicial Court of Maine reversed that decision, explaining that whether a comment is of a religious nature or whether it occurred because of an individual's religious beliefs or would have not occurred but for the individual's religion is a question of fact that a jury should decide. Brian's case is a good reminder that sometimes it takes a jury of one's peers to sort through all the facts in order to defend an employee's religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, we have in studio with us today Dr. Darrell Bock. Let me just mention again that the Table Podcast is a weekly podcast that relates to God, Christianity, and culture. And, of course, that is some of the things that he does as an individual that is involved in cultural engagement at the Hendricks Center and, of course, also senior research professor at the New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, author of more than 40 books, and this one that he has co-edited with Mitch Glaser really gets into some important issues. But let's, if we can, talk about one of the chapters. Is it sinful to divide the land of Israel? Mike Brown. Another one of those controversial issues.
Yeah, he walks through pretty carefully how important the land is and the role of the land. But he also makes the point that Israel has the right as a nation whose land it is to think about how she negotiates with the land that God has given to her. So he basically answers this question somewhat open-endedly.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say yes, he doesn't say no, but he does help people think through the various aspects of the question and holds open the possibility that that in the context of negotiations, you know, that there might be some option to deal with this. Of course, the other issue that's in the background, hovering in the background, is is that the size of the land that God gave to Israel versus the size of the land that Israel possesses is not the same.
Not the same.
So
very different.
Yeah. So there's that element of the equation as well. You know, the interesting thing about this conversation is almost any question you ask, there's the question, and then there's the stuff behind the question that you may or may not be aware of, that actually, in some cases, even complicates the answer even more.
Well, even here, we started the program today by talking about some of the rockets that were launched by Iranian troops in Syria landing in the Golan, and the fact that they've opened up some of those areas to protect those individuals. And when they did not have the Golan Heights, you could launch things into Israel
from a site above that was really strategically beneficial in terms of attack.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
And then, of course, how many times have we talked about what's happening in Gaza right now, and of course, then the so-called West Bank. So, I mean, every time you get into one of those issues, there are strategic issues, there are geographical issues, but of course there are biblical issues, which is one of the reasons you've written some of this.
That's right, and we're trying to show how the discussion touches on all those to one degree or another. In some cases, we're discussing them a little bit artificially separately from one another, but in other cases, we're putting kind of the whole stew together in one pot.
Yes. But again, while we look at Israel for just a minute, it is amazing when you think about it, the miracle of Israel. If we could back off historically and look at the fact that you had the Balfour Declaration, there was an attempt to create Transjordan, and then eventually you have the establishment of Israel, and immediately Israel has to defend itself.
That's right.
On a number of different occasions. Speak to that issue, because the miracle of Israel is pretty amazing, even when we look back 70 years.
Well, the amazing thing is that you had theologians in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, when Israel didn't exist and there wasn't a clue that it was going to happen, say, one day God is going to have a place where Jews can gather together. They will have their own nation. They will have their own land. And people would look at the maps and the political realities of the size of the Ottoman Empire and that kind of thing and go, no, come on.
Yeah.
No way. And then you watch the history of the emergence of the Zionist movement and the way in which that happened, and then what happened after World War I, and then with the Balfour Declaration, and then you move to the formation of the nation in 1948. This is the 70th year, as we mentioned, of the anniversary. And you go, how did that happen? And there's a part of you that can go, you can try and write all the kinds of rational, secular explanations for how that happened, and you go, I don't know if that quite takes care of it.
Yeah.
And so there's something about what has happened here that is an amazing story and an amazing reality. And I think it does show and indicate to one degree or another that God's hand is in this. Now, whether this is the absolute fulfillment of things that Scripture talks about, that could be discussed. But there's no doubt that what God has shown by the establishment of Israel is this is something he's quite capable of doing out of seemingly nothing.
Yes. The book ends with the Lifeway survey and then a piece that you put together on the conclusion and way forward. So help us understand how to use that, because this is another resource that might be really helpful for pastors, Sunday school leaders, small group leaders that might want to teach about Israel.
Well, the survey did two things. We actually released it in two parts. We had a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. in December, and then we followed it up with part two at the NRB meetings in February in Nashville. And we highlighted two different things about the survey. The first one was just, what do people think about Israel? And there are a whole series of questions, and you can go through and see kind of it's the state-of-the-art study about what people think about Israel, how connected are they, how aware are they of what goes on, all those kinds of things. And then the second part, which we did at the NRB, was more focused on what is Messianic Judaism, what does it look like, and how does it fit into the larger Jewish picture of where things are in the United States. This is where the surprising number popped up about how many people are networked into Jewish communities in their families without actually, in some cases, maybe entirely being aware of it and what that means. And so out of that, then we formed this Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem, which is an attempt, on the one hand, to say there's every biblical right for Israel to be in the land, and so a biblical rationale for the support of Israel responding to what is called replacement theology or the supersessionism, or what some people call fulfillment theology. I like to joke that if it's fulfillment theology, we need to read what the fulfiller has to say about Israel, and he sees a future for Israel. So even that doesn't work. And and yet at the same time try and balance it with the ethical requirements that anyone who names the name of God should have and how they treat people, and to balance. And so this way forward is to talk about the beauty of the picture of reconciliation that the gospel gives, the way in which the gospel calls us to step into relationships, even challenging relationships, in such a way that Christ can be a factor in helping to heal those broken wounds, that kind of thing, to restore people. There's a great theme throughout Scripture about restoration. In fact, the whole story of the Bible is a story of restoration. You have a broken relationship in Genesis 3, and the rest of the Scripture talks about how God's going to go about fixing that, and obviously Christ is in the center of that story. So the story of Israel is actually a microcosm of a picture of God's grace and faithfulness, which helps us to understand our own salvation.
Yes. Well, if nothing else, the Lifeway survey, I think, is a wake-up call to pastors and Sunday school teachers and others to say, first of all, there are a lot of people that don't know that much about Israel.
Right. We should talk about it more.
And that they really do want to know more and maybe really need to have some of that teaching. So what a great opportunity to get this book that deals with Israel, the church, and the Middle East. And it's published by Kriegel. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've got a link there. And also we have a link to dts.edu. And I would encourage those of you that are pastors, really connect up with the Cultural Engagement Center there at the Hendricks Center, because you're doing some great resources. And from time to time, you bring in speakers, and I would encourage someone to travel to Dallas to hear some of those speakers as well.
Yeah, we do conferences just about one a semester, and we do a Faith and Work conference located somewhere in the nation just about every year. We concentrate on obviously Christian leadership and cultural engagement. We're also very, very concerned about issues of faith and work and what we call cultural intelligence. Some people call it diversity, but the idea of understanding the variety of cultures that you have to interact with today. It's one of the ways in which our world has changed profoundly, and knowing who your neighbor is and how to interact with them is actually a pretty important part of living out the gospel.
All at dts.edu. And of course, I would also encourage you to connect up to the Table Podcast, and that doesn't require you traveling. Of course, you can also take some of the online courses, so all sorts of great resources. Darrell Bock, always great to have you in studio.
Oh, Kirby, it's great to be here as always.
200 hours of Table Podcast. Start watching it. It will take you a long time, and it covers a lot of great material. That's all we have for today. You can find out more on our website, pointofview.net. Want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Join us tomorrow for our weekend edition right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.